Hey everybody, and welcome to the first edition of online learning for what we're going to have. This is going to be a little bit different for us. We're going to try to keep things as similar to normal as possible. What it's going to be looking like, I'm going to post these notes for you. They're going to be a little bit different, but for the most part, they're going to have the same stuff. I'm not going to talk about everything that's going to be in your section of notes, so you will actually have more information than we're going to go over today. A lot of the information that I'm not going to go over is fun information, but not essentially the most prudent to talk about while we're doing this. And so I'm going to skip around a little bit and avoid some of those. Now, we're going to do bell work as normal, I guess we should say. But obviously, I'm not going to go to your house and check to see if you've done your bell work. So what I recommend is just take a second, pause this, and see how you can answer. Now, obviously, if you don't want to write it down, I can't enforce that, but it's honestly something good to think about before we start going through this. And so we've talked about it before. We've talked about a lot of the amendments. You should ideally have a decent idea which amendment established prohibition. So try to tell me which amendment actually started prohibition, and then beyond that, try to think and tell me about what some unintended side effects are. So what are some bad things that come with prohibition? So I would just take a second, pause it, and then hit continue. Here's how we're going to start, folks. When we left class, we just finished that test. We just finished World War I, and now we are going to look at what's happening in the 20s. This is going to be an interesting time simply because when we look back at it, it's highlighted by so many flamboyant things, but there's so much going on. And we are now 100 years past it. And holy cow, if you don't think we entered the 20s on a little bit of a heat streak, you're probably not realizing we're living in the same world, because holy cow, there's a lot of stuff going on. This will be stuff you'll be able to tell your kids, grandkids about, because it's definitely going to be something that they'll have to sit in history class, probably online entirely by then, like what we're doing now, and learn about what was happening when you were in your teens in the 20s. Anyway, as we get started, I just want to highlight some things about really what we're aiming to learn about as we're going through this. We need to look and understand how the 1920s actually went through and changed America, because this is going to be a turbulent time frame that is definitely going to shake up the construct of America. We understand pre-World War I America pretty well, but now we have to look at the social changes that are going to happen afterwards. So here's some things hopefully at the end of all this. I'm not saying at the end of today. I'm saying in several weeks when we're finished talking about the 20s, we need to be able to tell me how did the 1920s change music, literature, and art in America. All three are going to be impacted. I'm aiming to have you be able to tell me how this is going to happen. Second one, how did evolving social attitudes shape America during the 1920s? The third one, how is the current war on drugs similar to prohibition? And the last one, how is prohibition an unfair and unenforceable law? All of those, when we're finished, you will be able to answer, I guarantee it. But these are the big picture questions we have to have. Okay, so here's how we're going to get started. After the 1920s, America is going to see massive, massive change. We go from a piddly second-rate country to an eminent world power. Now, when this is happening, we have to consider all those factories were working really hard, particularly in urban areas. When this happened, a lot of people ended up moving into those urban areas to help the war effort, and that doesn't change after the war. In the 1920s, we're actually going to see an increased rate of people moving into the cities. This is going to be that key word right there in red, urbanization. Urbanization is going to be huge because until this point, really, America was defined as people living out on the farm, and it doesn't happen anymore. We start to see that decline. It's at this point, folks, where we start seeing more people live in cities than in rural areas. Now, take a look at Colorado. Most of our population is urban. Most of our land is rural. And so more people live in the cities than out in the sticks, kind of like how we do. To put this into perspective, at the time in 1920, New York City is going to have over 5 million people. Folks, we're having the census this year. It's 2020, but most likely Colorado is going to fall anywhere between 5.5 to 6 million people. So 100 years before this, New York City had roughly the same population as the entirety of Colorado does today. People are flocking there, they're seeking job opportunities, the lifestyle is attractive. There's a lot of things that are drawing people in. Now, Chicago is also a very large city at the time, and it has upwards of 3 million people. And so what we're seeing at this time, folks, is massive amounts of people flocking to the cities, and we're seeing these gigantic cities emerge that we still see around today. Now, this isn't all without any strife. When there's all these people leaving the rural areas to go into the city, there's a big culture change. There's a big culture shock, actually, and there's big different perceptions on what's happening in the city. If you lived in a city, or at least this was the perception, is that it was kind of a dirty place, it was run down, you're just lost in the crowd, you don't really know anybody. Anybody who's there is kind of full of greed and avarice. They're only trying to go out and make money for themselves. They're trying to go out and live fast, burning candles on both ends because we may not be around for a long time, but holy cow, we're going to make it bright. That was the perception of the city, is that it was just kind of big, overwhelming. Nobody knew who you were. It was kind of a difficult place, at least the perception, to be in. Now, on the flip side, life out in rural areas, life out in the farm, life out in the sticks was considered totally different. This was seen as taking like the slow track to life. People understood each other. You could have a conversation with random people who you may not know, but most people are going to know each other because everyone's kind of been around. And so it was more of a friendlier place. The perception of it was that it was a better area to raise families, where people were still willing to work hard, but more than anything have a set of morals. So take a second, see if you know what morals are. Morals are simply going to be a code that people are going to live by, kind of that intrinsic right and wrong of what people have. The perception was that in the city that wasn't really there. While this is all happening, though, it's difficult for people. It's difficult because there's so many changes that are going to happen. Now, with the whole rural-urban conflict, now we have to throw in all these different, different pieces of technology that are coming in, as well as different way to sell things and buy things, becoming a consumer. When this is happening, one of the biggest ones is going to be a car, something that most of you are getting to the point where you're starting to drive, or you've been driving for several years now, even if it has been illegally. I'm not pointing at anybody in specific, but the biggest thing is going to be is this actually gives people freedom. I mean, we have to consider at the time, if you were a teenager and you're going to go on a date with somebody, if you were a gentleman, you'd go over to your lady friend's house and you would sit there and you'd have dinner, and her entire family would be there, and then you would escort yourself home on your horse. Now, if you are fortunate enough to have enough money and your family has a car, you could actually go on a date, which is a totally new concept because now it's pretty rare to be like, yes, come over to my father's house and we shall have tea and crumpets. When at this time, that's kind of what people had to do. Now, the other one's going to be is consumerism, folks. We're going to start to see brand recognition develop at this time that's still around today. Take a look at the picture. We can see the name, and obviously it says Coca-Cola, but even if it was something in similar font, we would know it meant Coca-Cola. We're going to start seeing Americans really become really diehard consumers at this point. Some of the brand recognition that's developed around this time, still around today, obviously Coca-Cola is going to be one. Now, this is where it's going to start getting fun, folks. This is where bell work is going to tie into what we're talking about, because when we're talking about the 1920s into the 30s as well, we have to talk about a 13-year period known as Prohibition. Okay, Prohibition is going to be something that stands as one of the most intriguing parts of American history. What we're going to be looking at is going to be a 13-year span from 1920 to 1933 of when Making, selling, and transporting liquor is going to be illegal. This is going to be set up with the 18th Amendment. It's going to happen in 1920, folks. Okay, so the 18th Amendment establishes prohibition, and then the entire time, that 13-year span, is going to be known as prohibition. This is going to be something we're going to be looking at. It's going to highlight the big issues between the city folk and the country folk. Newsflash for you, there's one group that wants prohibition and there's one group that doesn't. So here's what we're looking at. We have to first identify where the support for prohibition is coming from. At this time, we have to consider that things are different. If you were to watch a sporting event, which none of us are going to for a while because they're all canceled because of the virus, there's a lot of times like beer commercials. And so if there's a beer commercial, now they're all required to say things like drink responsibly. Well, the problem is 100 years ago, there was really no message for drink responsibly. And so when we're looking at prohibition, what it ends up being is these people who are pushing for prohibition are doing so because when people would go out drinking, they would become belligerent. There was a lot of abuse for children and women because husbands would go out and become completely inebriated. A lot of crime happened because of it. And so when people are pushing for prohibition, it's not like because they just think that nobody should have fun, but I mean, it honestly was detrimental to society at the time. Okay. But now here's where it ties in with the clash of the cultures. People who really supported it were from rural areas, particularly in the South and the West. Okay. A lot of the city folk didn't really want prohibition. It was people from out in the country. Okay. Now, there's going to be a lot of religious support for prohibition as well. There's going to be an anti-saloon league, which is going to have backing by the church, and a group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And all of these people are really going to be pushing and advocating for the 18th Amendment to go through. Now, if you take a look at the picture on the left, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. So what these ladies are saying is like they will not be associated with any fella who is drinking. Now, we've just finished doing a lot of propaganda, so take a second and look and kind of analyze this one. Right at the top, it's going to say, help me to keep him pure. Please vote against the sale of liquors. And it's showing a mother with a young son. What this one's going to be showing for, it's going to kind of highlighting the overall arching theme of trying to protect society by establishing prohibition. Once again, it's not like we're trying to ruin everybody's fun. It's, holy cow, people are being abusive. People are becoming drunk and going on crime sprees. We need to help save people kind of from themselves is what this is aiming at doing. Now, this part is going to be kind of technical, so please try to stay with me as we're going through this. What we're going to look at for this particular point is still involving prohibition, but it's kind of different terminology. It's going to be called the Volstead Act. Okay. The Volstead Act is going to be used to enforce prohibition. What I mean by that is think about like Jim Crow laws and segregation in the South. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation. The Volstead Act enforces prohibition. That's how this is all going to be tied together. So it'd be a violation of the Volstead Act if you produced, sold, or transported any form of alcohol. Now with this though, this is where it gets really complicated, folks. Once again, laws always have loopholes. This is one of the worst. The Volstead Act says nothing about being illegal to drink, purchase, or possess liquor. Only produce, sell, or transport. So when this happens, a lot of people had bunches of alcohol and it wasn't illegal for them to hold on to it. And so it's going to cause problems as far as how do we enforce this rule? How are we going to be able to go through and enforce, well, do they actually sell it to anybody? Or are they just holding on to it? Were they transporting it? Was it not transported? There's so many loopholes in this, folks. It's a really big issue. Okay. Now, along with this, though, it's going to be used to discriminate against people, particularly Catholics and Irish. All right. Those are two big groups at the time who are being kind of targeted at this point against, or I guess by the federal government. Now, later on, it's not going to be in this video, but later on, we're going to talk about the second emergence of the Ku Klux Klan. And they're particularly going to target Catholics. Okay, and so this is going to be a group that is definitely going to be discriminated at during this time frame. Now, with prohibition, we've already highlighted not everybody is going to think that drinking is so bad. Now, most people are against kind of like the point where people are becoming so drunk that they're abusive, but um, people at this time, I mean, they just weren't ready to stop drinking. Think about it today. It's if the government said, okay, folks, nobody is going to drink, absolute ban on alcohol. It's probably not going to happen. Now, one of the biggest groups with this, we just identified Irish and Catholics. Immigrant groups weren't going to do it, folks. Flat outright against it. We have to consider some of the cultures of these areas these people were moving in from. Italy, there's going to be a lot of drinking wine. In Ireland, we're going to have a lot of whiskey and beers and all those things. And so these people are having an absolute refusal to stop that. Now, the problem with it is, if you're caught doing these illegal activities, there's going to be some pretty severe punishments. And so people were not going to give up drinking, but they couldn't just do it outright. And so we're going to see an emergence of something called speakeasies. That's going to be a key word for you there in the red. With these speakeasies, people are going to be in like hidden areas where there would be a saloon. Now, some of these could just be kind of like in a downstairs basement area, but there's a lot of intricate ways to get into them. Some would be like the classic hidden behind a bookshelf. You pull out the right book and then the doors open up. Some are going to be really intricate like that. So just know some are really fancy in that aspect. Some are simply just a place to go hide and get a drink. Okay. Another big thing, what we're going to start seeing is bootlegging. That's the next red term for you. Illegal liquor is going to be smuggled in from other areas, including like the West Indies, Cuba, all those islands down the Caribbean, but as well as Canada. Now, Canada is going to have a great big border with the United States at this point, and so it's going to be relatively easy to sneak it in. Okay. Now, bootlegging is going to become a problem later on. We're really going to highlight that, particularly with the rise of organized crime. These people who are running these big crime organizations at this point get started with prohibition. Prohibition creates big organized crime that's still around today. Once again, prohibition is one of the things where it causes more problems than it solves. Okay, prohibition is going to lead to major crime in basically every major city across the United States at this point. Now, a fun one we're going to talk about is going to be a guy named Al Capone. Al Capone is a bootlegger. He was known for being incredibly ruthless. He is going to end up massacring off a lot of his competition. So if you were against this guy, you kind of either had to bend to his will and kind of join his ranks, or just face the fact that he's probably going to try to kill you. And the reality was, a lot of his competitors didn't want to bow down to him, and so they tried to compete with him, and he killed them. There's going to be instances of them documenting massacres against this guy, but the problem is he himself didn't really commit crimes. He had his guys commit crimes, but he never really did. And so what's going to end up happening, folks, a guy named Elliot Ness is going to be with the law enforcement. He's going to create a group, a task force, basically to take down Al Capone. They're going to be called the Untouchables. And so Al Capone, this great gangster of Chicago, is going to be brought in not for any form of murder, but of tax evasion. The guy didn't pay his taxes, and so he ended up being charged. Now, you're like, well, how didn't he pay his taxes? Well, the reality is Al Capone lived a lavish lifestyle, and he did report taxes, but there's no way his income could support, or his legal income, I should say, could support his lifestyle that he was having. Okay. And so what we're going to end up looking at now is going to be how the government isn't going to be able to actually produce enough force to go through and control prohibition. Okay. The government is going to have great big ideals as far as what it wants to do with prohibition, but the reality is it can't enforce it. If the government was going to go through and actually try to enforce prohibition, they would need a ton more money. What ends up happening is they go through and they only have 1,500 federal agents. Now, that might seem like a lot, but we have to consider this is for the entirety of the United States. 1,500 agents to enforce that people aren't making, transporting, or selling alcohol. That's not going to happen, folks. And so it was kind of ruined right from the start. Okay. Now, what ends up happening is most people didn't actually support prohibition. Only about 19% of Americans are going to actually go through and want prohibition. Now, that's not very good, folks. If we're looking at anything, like usually something has to be around 50% for it to stay through, because that's going to be a simple majority. But I mean, we've highlighted a lot of issues with it today, and this isn't anywhere near as in depth as we could go. But I mean, the reality was prohibition causes so many issues that it's not worth keeping around. And so what ends up happening is, after 13 years of prohibition, starting in 1920, running into 1933, the prohibition is going to be formally repealed with the 21st Amendment. And so the easiest way to remember this one is the 18th Amendment establishes prohibition. Now, if you think back to maybe when your parents were in school, actually it was probably longer than that, but you used to be able to drink when you were 18, and now it's 21. So the 18th Amendment establishes prohibition, the 21st ended it.